So welcome to the OpenJS Cross Project Council meeting for August 3rd, 2021. We'll follow the agenda that was tagged in the issue, which was 785 in the repo. Before we get started, are there any announcements that people would like to share?
Just a quick encouragement for anyone interested in getting involved in planning OpenJS World. The program committee took a very brief break right after OpenJS World 2021, and we're getting really excited about OpenJS World 2022, which is tentatively planned to be in person. And so one of the things we're brainstorming now that we would love input on and love participation with is like, who should we think about for keynotes, and what topics do we want to do call for proposals on for next year, and like all of that fun stuff. What fun things do we want to do because we're going to be in person and we can play mini golf together or something. So please, if you're interested, come to those meetings. We're meeting bi-weekly. So our next meeting is not this Thursday, but the following Thursday, and that is on our OpenJS Foundation public calendar. So take a gander and join us if you can.
Okay, thanks, Dory. Is there any other announcements that people would like to make? If not, we might as well move on to the board meeting updates. I don't think I have any updates. I don't know, Sarah, if you have any updates this week. No, looks like no updates this week.
Yeah, no update.
Okay. So let's move on to the issues that were tagged for the agenda. The first one is number 783, Chore Update Node.js Representative. And I think this is on the agenda as a bit of a FYI that Rich is going to be taking over from Mary as the Node.js CPC representative from the TSC.
Cool.
Woohoo!
Woohoo.
Well, I mean,
okay.
We'll miss you, Mary, but also, yay, Rich.
Yeah. Okay. And I'm just going to, thanks for whoever's taking the notes there. That's great. We can move over then to the next issue, which is number 782, which is Simplify COC page. I think, Toby, you opened that?
Yes, I did. This was following a pull request that Jory and I had a conversation on. And I think I also opened up a new pull request for that. Essentially, I think the point and what was brought up in the initial pull request was the state of the code of conduct page is kind of confusing. There's like a list of all of the projects, and some actually point to like a special email or a special way of contacting folks. Some don't point to anything. Some point to a common mailing list that is also owned by the CPC. And so all of that was kind of confusing. So I offered a simplification in the new pull request, which essentially says, if you're in project space, if there's an email in that list of like 6 projects, that's the one you should call. If not, you should call the CPC. You should email the CPC folks. And if you want to escalate, here's the escalation. And if it's an event, here's the thing. So the idea was just like make that simpler and easier to access for people.
And I now remember I added it to the CPC agenda. The thing, and it may be that I've just forgotten or whatever, but like, it seems to say that the CPC is responsible for any project that doesn't have their own reporting process. And I'm not sure that that was documented anywhere or was in our initial, like if I went and looked at our initial scope and I didn't see it listed there. So it doesn't seem like a bad idea to me necessarily, but something I thought would be good to have the CPC at least aware of and think about, that the wording, at least to me, said, if any project doesn't have their own process, the CPC is responsible for managing one for them. So Toby?
Yeah, just to be clear, like this was already the case beforehand, except that was sort of buried in more text, and so it was less visible. So we're actually, the PR itself doesn't change that. It just eventually makes it more clear. And so, that's a good like that clarity is a good outcome. So we can actually talk about this, but it's sort of like orthogonal, really.
Yeah, is it? I'm not sure that, where did it say before that the, like, there was a section that said the issues to report, so report an issue in a project. The project itself, let's see. That's where I could have missed it somewhere. Just trying to find in the deleted.
Wait, let me look for the exact line.
Like, it certainly says the CPC is responsible for ones that are spaces managed by the foundation. It's basically this line that I thought was new.
Yeah, so I stand corrected. I think you're right, and that wasn't actually explicitly mentioned, which is actually in that case even worse because it was kind of assumed. Plus, some projects actually opted into doing that by using the list, the reports, the report at list that actually goes to the CPC. So, yes.
Yes, so there are a handful of projects which have explicitly said, you know, we delegate this to you all and, you know, thank you. There are also a number of projects that, particularly older projects from the former JS Foundation, that didn't clearly have a process designated and have not clearly yet designated that process. So, you know, in the absence of that clarity that needs to be provided by the projects, we certainly don't want the community to not have a path, I think, if there is an issue. And so, you know, and maybe that's where the question mark lies, is when we get a report from one such project that hasn't made that clear designation, what does an individual do if they can't find the project's reporting preference? So that's something where in some cases the projects really are on maintenance mode. They're not actually, you know, active. So we could offer to the community and to that maintainer, like, hey, this line, just in case, is backup. Or we could try and go more aggressively, get them to update the space on their own repositories with our reporting information or with one that we help them create. But I think it is fair for our community to implicitly assume that if they can't find information about reporting an incident on a project, that the CPC is available to help them find that path.
I think even but what you said, find that path is subtly different from we've taken ownership for anybody who doesn't have one. We've taken ownership. I'm not saying that that's actually a bad thing. I'm mostly saying it's not listed like in the CPC charter. And so if we think that's a good idea, we should add it to the CPC charter and make it explicit that, you know, projects today, I think it's kind of like, it's clear that if it's a project under the OpenJS Foundation space, the CPC will do it. It's clear that the projects can do it themselves. What's not clear is that the OpenJS and CPC, or the CPC in particular, is a backstop for anybody who doesn't do it. Which, you know, could be just another line that says in the charter that says, for any project that doesn't have their own reporting process, the CPC is responsible for managing that process.
That makes sense, and maybe we could add that, like, as a next step, unless anyone thinks it's a bad idea. I have to jump in a minute, but I'll follow up in the notes.
I also think there's a difference. I think there's a difference between is responsible for that process and it is that process like reporting to the CPC or whatever, wherever it goes or wherever report at lists goes. Like being responsible for that process means defining that process for each project, which I don't think is what we want. I think it is, we are, or whoever's on that list is the ones who will be dealing with it, not we're going to define a process for this project. and like they'll have like that is both something that I don't think we want to do in terms of
No.
In terms of like telling projects this is how you are moderated, and also just in terms of like the work. I don't think either of those are something we want.
I agree. I think it needs to be a deliberate decision by the projects to direct to the CPC. And maybe that's default because they don't have the resources, but at least instead of it being a catch-all, being a deliberate action by the projects.
Okay, because that's a different than what was written. What was written is like, hey, if they don't do anything, then it comes to the CPC. What I think I just heard Robin said, we wouldn't necessarily take ownership of that if they didn't do anything.
We should, but I think a requirement to be in the OpenJS Foundation is that you have a code of conduct process, correct? So
That is true. So we do have a little bit of a catch-22 where there may be projects that, you know, they've adopted it in the sense that it's like attached to their repositories in some way, but technically aren't enforcing it because they don't have that process identified. And that would be something that we should be concerned about as a cross community.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. You have to
I
go,
was just
Jory.
going to say I have to go, but I added some comments about issue 772, which is the next in the chat.
Yeah.
So
Thanks.
thanks all.
thanks, Jory.
Bye.
Yeah, just to clarify, what I was trying to do here is I can't imagine that we would have a project was a code of conduct violation problem that would come to the CPC and we would just be like, well, we're sorry, the project hasn't created anything, right? Because obviously, like the next step for them would be, well, I'm then going to just escalate this to the CPC, which I'm, you know, it's my right to do. And so literally, like, you know, we're essentially adding sort of like a weird tiny stumbling block in the process that is not really useful. And so like I think that from the perspective of talking to the projects, we should probably be talking to them and telling them, hey, listen, we don't have anything for you. Are you okay that is like your plan for this to default to the CPC? But from the perspective of someone actually reporting an issue, it would not, it's like they should not be sort of hurt by the fact that we don't have this organized the way it should be.
Agreed.
That was sort of like,
yeah, agreed. We don't want friction by the end user. We don't want it buried. So, you know, they should hit us if they don't know, and then we can figure it out on the back end if needed.
I kind of agree with Toby's. I think what he's saying though is, like from my perspective, we should make it explicit that if a project doesn't put something in place, the CPC is responsible for managing it, right? And so
yes.
that's their opt-in. It's sort of, I guess it's there's a requirement that you have one. If you don't do something, that's implicitly opting into the CPC doing it for you, right? And as long as we message that to the projects, you know, it should be clear. Like, we're not telling you what to do, but you got to do something. And if you don't do something, then we take responsibility. And that seems like a clear. And like Toby's saying, it's most likely going to effectively be the same anyway, because we, you know, as a group, the buck stop is probably going to stop here anyway. So let's make that up front and make it clear, as opposed to people saying, well, do I or don't I or whatever, right?
And just like to quickly like add to this, like what drove me to actually like suggest those changes is I was like, you know, in this list, we now had folks that had their own system, you know, like for example, like Hospital Run had their own like email, which was hello@hospitalrun.io. And then Maka had report@lists.openjsf.org, which was also the default, sort of like the CPC one, right? And so that's like, so what does it mean about, say, NVM that doesn't have anything? You know, it's like, it's creating this really confusing thing for people actually looking at this page. And I don't think that's the purpose of that page. So I think we agree that this is a direction in which we want to go, except we want to make that more clear in the charter itself. And we also want to do some outreach to the projects that haven't made a decision.
We can do an inventory as well of where all the projects are and help on that outreach. So.
I
So yeah, I'm
think that
just
would be
saying next
useful.
steps.
Oh, cool.
Sorry, no, go ahead. I was just putting in, so PR into charter, you mentioned, what was the other thing, Toby, you mentioned was?
Well, doing some outreach, which Robin offered that the
Okay.
foundation would do. And just was like a tiny asterisk here. That is, some projects have actually opted into having the CPC do this, right? And some projects haven't done anything. And so, when we do the outreach, we probably want to be careful about this, because it's kind of weird if we, go to like Maka, or I think it was ESLint actually had a pull request adding, opting into having the CPC do it. And now, reaching back out to them and tell them, well, you haven't made a decision yet, right? What is it that you want, right? So just like, being a bit wary of that. That would, and then lastly, actually, like project like Apium says email maintainers in reporting, which I think is kind of like a little not really helpful. If someone wants to really reach out quickly, they're having a problem, it should be a bit more explicit, I feel. And so we actually really should have something that's clearly actionable from that page directly, rather than
That starts to get into suggestions though, like that's good feedback to them, but if we actually were telling them it's not good enough, then we're starting to get into, and we'll have minimum requirements on your process. Just saying, it's like that's a potential. It's like we haven't strayed into telling people what they have to do yet.
I get your point, but I think like the request should be something along the lines of provide a simple, direct way for people to report code of conduct to the project, or have the CPC do that. But it feels as if like, you essentially saying something like, we want to be, as a project, we want to be able to handle this, but the only way to actually open a code of conduct issue is to stand on your head outside, this address. Then like, I think there's a point in which we have to, be in the conversation and say, well, that's not enough, or that's not acceptable. That's not an acceptable reporting system.
I just like,
I don't think, sorry.
I'm not arguing against, but if we want to impose requirements, we should probably write those down somewhere and say, if you want to have your own, here's our requirements on them. Or like, it's perfectly fair to give them feedback as well, but is it a requirement versus some feedback?
I agree with both of you. We should be writing that down if that's a thing we're gonna do. I also think it's a thing we should do. So, like I have personally criticized other projects in the JavaScript ecosystem in the past for setting the one maintainer who has been problematic as the COC report, as like, email me if you have a problem. But if the problem's with that person, then you're kind of like you don't get the solution. So I agree with that. Like, I don't think individuals should ever be a COC report. It needs to be an alias or a group.
Oh, you're adding additional requirements. So
I mean, I think
well, that's where I think it's worth having a separate issue to write those down in caption.
Okay.
Right?
Yep. No.
It's a very slippery slope of like, and it should be, if we're going to get into that space, we should carefully define and make sure we're in agreement with what we're trying to capture there. So I added that as an extra next step.
So what would be like, how do we split this work up? Just to be clear, like, do we are we okay with that pull request, or do we want to hold onto that pull request until we clarify the rest of the stuff? What do we do?
I think we should PR into the charter, which then requires, like, since it's a change to the charter, would be board approval. you know,
And
whether
tight-
we,
Yeah.
you know, that technically maybe, you know, this should technically wait for that. Maybe the rest of the stuff, I don't think so. It's just like, if we're actually saying, hey, yeah, we're responsible for it, then it's probably should be in the charter. But I don't feel super strongly whether we need to wait or not on that, because we could always take it out, I guess, if it turned out not to, there'd be a challenge, which I doubt.
All right, so concretely, we're okay with merging this and doing the charter work in a different pull request.
Yeah.
And we're
Um,
opening.
Yeah.
I don't care either way.
It could be in this PR, couldn't it?
Okay.
This pull
Oh,
request?
that too. Yeah,
Like
sure.
if we add the
that's okay
change
for
to the
board,
charter to this pull request and then we get board approval and then we land it, that makes total sense.
that works for me if that's okay with the board, and they won't be lost in the different how broad the pull request is.
I think we could put it in the email, like here's the specific
Okay.
thing that requires board approval. So
That works for me. I'm happy to take on that specific thing. If we want to have a specific policy about what should be required, does that need to be board approved and then the charter, or is that something that needs to be somewhere else? And if so, where, and do we open an issue for that? Sorry for being very specific.
that, I wonder, I'd have to go back and look at like the scope. Like we have the board, the CPC's charter is to do X and specifically not to do Y. If the not to do Y includes telling projects how to run things, we might have to tweak that, and that might require charter change, but I don't know up ahead whether that's separate one. I think we should treat that as a separate discussion, right? Like get this landed, this clarity is good regardless of that. And then
That
as a
makes
separate
sense.
issue, it's like, hey, we might want to ask the projects to do more if they do have their own, right?
Okay, so I'll file an issue for that separate topic.
Sounds good. So I had three things. Next steps: PR into charter, add to the existing PR. Outreach, Robin volunteered to clarify what will happen if they don't opt in to the projects. And then the third one is to write.
I'll
was
also
that?
do an inventory of all of our projects and what their process and contact is. So
That should be partially covered in, okay, maybe, I mean, the PR that Toby has here has some of that info, right? Like it has the ones that have contact info. It may not have the rest of the details though, so.
we have
It's starting.
we have 38 projects, so we need to. Toby, did you go through all 38?
Oh, no, I looked at the data that was there and essentially kept the one that was and removed the ones that were pointing to the CPC's email address. That's the only thing I did. I didn't do any work.
Okay.
Right, so yeah, if there's other ones that have the processes, but they didn't get added there, that would be good to know for sure if you're going to look at that, Robin, to make sure we don't say, hey, yeah, report it to the CPC if they happen to have one. So that fits together.
Awesome.
Okay, well, I think we have some good next steps there, so I'd suggest we move on to the next issues. Okay. Clarify whether it's a requirement to use either CLA or DCO at OpenJS Foundation. I'm opening that one up. I think there was some discussion back and forth. Is there anything more? I know, Toby, you had the last comment there.
My recollection is folks regret that it isn't more clear in the IP policy that you can pick one or the other, but have to have one or the other. And that the best that the CPC could provide in that area was essentially to have the clarify this in the IP policy guidance, which it already does. And hence the only open question is, do we feel like we want to have a modification of the IP policy to clarify that point, which seems like a lot of work for a minor clarification? Maybe we should bundle, like have a list somewhere of IP clarifications that we would like to see in the IP policy that when, you know, when we have a lot, or when there's another change that's happening anyway, we could add in that policy. I think that would be useful. But I can't imagine that we would bring in like all of the folks that need to be involved in an IP policy change just for clarifying that point, which is sort of, if you read in between the lines in the IP policy, it's kind of clear. I mean, it says like if you want to use a CLA, you have to get board approval. And then like the board has approved like a CLA already. So like there's a like all of this is kind of complicated, right? But like this is only complicated when a new project comes in the foundation and has to walk this. And they should be relying on the IP policy guidance doc for this anyway. So I mean, I hate to just close this and say we're not going to do the work. So I think we should close this and say this is a noted clarification point that we will bring, that will be part of the next IP policy change whenever that happens.
I'm just reading the I guess it's the question of like, will we remember, where do we store that list of things to be updated versus how much effort it is to update it in the first place?
How much effort it is to update it in the first place? Does anyone know? To me, it feels like that needs to go through board approval, and board members will need to have broad conversations with their attorney to understand what they can change and what they can't. Like it feels like complicated.
Yeah, that is likely true.
Anything IP related.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I don't know if there's an option for us to just send it to the lawyer, like send something to the lawyer saying, next time there's an update, please take this feedback that it needs to be like, put it on them to remember that. I don't know if that works at all, or somewhere, you know, is there some, I guess
You're
it's like
worse than
who in
I
the
am.
foundation should remember this, right?
I vote for like a chair of sorts or an ED of sorts, you know. I mean, like either sort of you, Michael, or sort of you, Robin. Like,
I'm just
we can
thinking
have a document about this.
who's guaranteed to be in the loop on the next, you know, the next round of updating that.
I mean, like that's part of the problem of like who's going to be in the loop.
Yeah.
But then the other part of the problem is like, you know, like the number of people this information has traveled to. Once it gets to like lawyers of like board members, it's like you're talking about like 4, 5, or 6 people in between, and the risk of this being misunderstood, understood differently, or dismissed as like a request for like a substantial change when it's not, are kind of large. So that's the other aspect that I find kind of like you know, that bothers me. Do we know when changes to the IP policy happen? Like,
I
as
think
of
the answer
never?
is not only when needed. Like, I don't think it'll change at all unless there's a reason for us to change it.
Right. Rarely, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's no next scheduled time or anything like that. I mean, I suspect it could be years, right? Like, is the kind of thing, the time frame that we're talking.
Well, why don't we just label this as IP policy change? and just park it and it was like a special label.
I think I'm fine with something like that. I mean, it's kind of like if we don't think it's important enough to do now, then just sort of trying to remember is probably the right sort of level of risk that we can take.
I literally cannot imagine someone being okay to organize a meeting with that many people for a clarification of that nature. Like I would not personally be willing to burn social capital for something like this. So I really doubt anyone else would be willing to do that, because I'm happy to burn social capital on a regular basis for stuff like this. So, you know.
We do convene the member councils at least quarterly. So, you know, that would be fine. We could pick it up in the fall or in September or October.
That's an offer I would take. I mean, you know.
If it's fair to say, the final discussion, we'll keep this open. If / when there is some other update to the IP policy, then we'll bring it up. We'll bring up clarifying this point. In the meantime, the guidance doc is pretty clear, right? It's kind of what we're saying. Okay, and then we'll just remove from the agenda. Okay, let's move on to the next one. I just want to actually just take that in the notes so that we have it here for anybody who's reading them as well. Okay, Cpc Chairman Election. It sounds like from Jory, who had to drop off, that there weren't any other candidates other than Joe. So I think we can say, welcome back, Joe. Congratulations, right?
Jory did mention that we would need to ask Joe whether Joe had received any nominations.
Ah, okay.
It would, my understanding is you usually don't do that. You make sure that whoever is actually also a candidate doesn't receive candidate requests. But yeah.
So maybe I can say, Jory mentioned she did not receive any other nominations. We need to make sure that Joe did not receive any otherwise. If not, then, you know, we don't need a vote, right?
Yep.
Okay, so I took that as the minutes. Reminder for long-term events. I don't know if there's anything new on this.
I don't think so either. I think we just have it there because we need to be reminded of it.
Okay, so I will say no update on that. The next one is create proposals for the community fund, number 756. I think, Robin, you had an action to go off and create a proposal.
Yeah, I'm just about done with the application and the sort of preamble. I guess the question is, who do we go back to our little working committee to work on it? I think we had agreed in our last meeting, just from a process perspective, let me pull my notes, that we would have a small committee to review. That's even the applications coming in. And then, but the CPC private would do a vote on the recipients. But I guess the question is, as I'm finishing up this, like this, you know, the scholarship application document and the preamble, do we want to take that back to our working group or have it?
I'd be like, just send it to the CPC, and unless there's something that's controversial, needs more discussion, like people might just look at it and say, sure.
Okay. I'll do that.
And if there is something that needs more dive to, then you could propose that.
Okay. we'll do
Yeah,
that.
I second that. I think it's really a matter of how you feel about it. If you're
I'm
like,
fine
you know,
with that.
if you want more input, then that makes sense. And if not, like,
Okay.
yeah, just going through the CPC makes sense.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm sure you are. I was just like, oh, you know, in case you weren't.
Yeah. Okay, I'll do that.
Okay, the last one, although there was another one I added somewhere, maybe I didn't have added too late, but anyway, provide implementation guidance for DCO CLA.
This waits
Um,
on Brian, is my understanding.
Yeah, so I don't know if there's any update, Robin, if you've heard from him or anything.
No, he has
Okay.
been, yeah, in communication with the maintainer. It was the update we gave a couple of weeks ago. They don't have the bandwidth right now, and they have an issue open to try to find support on their project end. So no update.
Okay, and I think I may have added it to one place, but not the other. So let me just find it, the last issue. Just gotta go to the main issue itself. Just take me one sec. Right, so the last one is just the kickoff of the election process for the secondary CPC director. Based on the timelines in the charter, it's now time. So we need to kick that vote off. I think I asked in the issue if Jory and Joe would sort of run that, and I think they said let's kick it off in this meeting and go from there. So it's, go ahead.
And none of them are here, right?
Well, I think they don't need to be here to sort of give the CPC the heads up that, hey, the director election is starting, and to basically let Joe or Jory know if you want to run. Joe did make a proposal in terms of the time. So basically kick it off now, nominations open for 2 weeks, and then voting for 2 weeks.
This is your seat, is that correct?
Yes,
Michael?
correct.
Are you representing yourself, or however that's called?
I was thinking maybe I should just let them know in private. Like I'm willing to do it either way, but just I was thinking to not put off people. Maybe I shouldn't, but I just thought if I do that, I can't undo it. So I'd let the CPC decide which they preferred.
I'm sorry, I just completely ruined what it was that you wanted to do by essentially making you say what you were not going to say. That I mean, yeah, sorry. Apologies for having to ask that question.
No problem. So anyway, I basically, if you're interested, send your nomination to your self-nomination or nominate somebody else, as long as they're willing to one of those two. And I think it's that timeline makes sense for everybody.
All I can say is time flies, and Michael, you've been super awesome. So whether you run or not, yeah.
Wonderful. So we did it. And
okay, so kicked off. Yep. And I think that gets us to the end. And there's 2 minutes left in our agenda. Is there anything else we should talk about?
The work session next week, if there's anything.
Yeah, there is a pinned issue for topics. And I believe Jory's been making updates as those change. Let me go. If you go to CPC issues, pinned issue, meeting schedule. We had August 10th working meeting. Working session with the package security vulnerability working group or the community fund.
Well, it's the former, right? Because the community fund, we don't need to meet, was what you were saying, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So is anyone that's in this meeting now or aware of what's going on in the package security stuff?
Thanks, Rachel. Bye. We had our initial meeting. We're trying to reconvene and trying to find time where folks from other time zones can join, because right now the holding time that we can meet either bi-weekly or even once a month is alternates from the Node.js tooling working group. That's correct, Michael. So that was sort of an easy calendar hold, but we need to reach folks from other time zones and perhaps some security experts as well to see if they can suggest other times.
I guess the question is, do we need that to be in this slot next week?
That's a good question.
Because it sounds like it's more about finding a time that works for that group versus the CPC.
Yeah. And I think trying to retrofit that group into this CPC time may be difficult as well.
So the answer to, is there a work
Is there a
shop
work
next
group
week?
we have? Yeah.
Is no, essentially? Or
It could be like, is tech strategy closed out? I know I couldn't make the last one, but I don't know if there's something, I know we don't have anything fully written out yet, but I don't know if there's anything that makes sense in terms of having a session or not.
Sounds like we need to get an answer to that and decide like asynchronously.
That would make sense.
it's also summer, and I think if we want to sort of skip one meeting, that's
Mhm.
feels
Yeah.
also
True.
okay.
And attendance has been pretty low in the summer, just in the last 2 working sessions. So that may be an issue as well.
Let's skip it.
Mhm.
I'm all for working less.
Yeah. Not a meeting for meeting's sake. Agreed. So,
Sounds good. Thanks, y'all.
Okay. Yep.
Thanks.
Okay.
care,
Well,
folks.
thanks
Bye.
for everybody who watched, and